Everybody doing? Wonderful. I heard that one. Okay. Well, welcome to BMA Violet Hour. My name is Tracy Beal. I'm the manager of public programs here at the Baltimore Museum of Art. I'm delighted to see so many of you here. I know we're having some funky weather today, so thank you for joining us. As you know, tonight's program is inspired by the exhibition A Movement in Every Direction, Legacies of the Great Migration, and I'm really happy to say that we have free admission for the exhibition this evening. So after tonight's talk, you can go right out to the left, and the exhibition is there, so you're free to enter through till 9 p.m. tonight. Before I get into introducing tonight's guests, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of the talk this evening. This talk is being live streamed as well as recorded, so if you do want to ask a question or have a statement that you want to say, just wait for someone to pass the mic to you before you actually do that. And so without further ado, let's hear about our first guest. I think a lot of people are familiar with her. So Zoë Charlton. Are we all familiar with Zoë Charlton? Yeah? Zoë Charlton creates, and they're clapping back here, it's cute. Zoë Charlton creates works on paper, installations, and animations that depict her subject's relationship to cultural objects and landscapes. Her artist residencies include Artpace in Texas, the McColl Center for Art and Innovation in North Carolina, and the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine. Her exhibitions include Harvey B. Gantt Center in North Carolina, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in, that's not in Poland, in Arkansas, and the Zacheta National Gallery of Art in Poland. She is the co-founder of Kindred Creative Residencies in Agro-ForesT in Vermont, and Charlton also holds a seat on the Maryland Arts Council and is a board member for the Washington Project for the Arts in DC. Charlton thrives here in Baltimore, Maryland, and she's a professor of art at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Our second guest is Torkwase Dyson. I think a lot of you are familiar with Torkwase Dyson as well. Her work is one of the first works that you see going into the exhibition, which is quite stunning. Torkwase Dyson received a BFA from the Maryland Commonwealth University in 1999. She has an MFA from Yale School of Art in Painting and Printmaking from 2003. She works in multiple media. Dyson describes herself as a painter whose forms address the continuity of ecology, infrastructure, and architecture. She merges ideas such as site and built environments, nature, and culture under the rubric of environmentalism. Fascinated with transformation, ambiguity, and environmental changes that place these objects in the relationship to each other, her work revolves around investigating our connection to imagination, materiality, geography, and belonging. Our final guest is Jamea Richmond-Edwards, coming to us from Detroit. Oh, yes, for the fans, okay. Jamea Richmond-Edwards creates mixed media collages, utilizing a variety of papers and hand-drawn elements. Her paintings examine the intersection of Black and Indigenous American history. Richmond-Edwards holds a BFA from Jackson State, where she studied painting and drawing, and an MFA from Howard University. She is a recipient of the 2019 Joan Mitchell Painters and Sculptors Award and a 2020 recipient of the Joan Mitchell Artist in Residency. Jamea has exhibited her work nationally as well as internationally. Her work is included in the collections of the Studio Museum in Harlem and the Rubel Family Collection. She currently resides in Detroit with her husband and 3 children, or 3 sons to be exact. So finally, moderating tonight's program is Jessica Bell Brown. Jessica Bell Brown is the curator for the exhibition that we're all here for tonight. She's also the department head. You guys clapping back there? She's also the department head for contemporary art here at the Baltimore Museum of Art, and she's the co-curator for A Movement in Every Direction. And this project, as you know, was a joint project along with the Mississippi Museum of Art. Her other recent exhibitions here at the BMA include How Do We Know the World, Thaddeus Mosley, Forest, and Stephanie Sayuko, Vanishing Point Overlay. Prior to joining us here at the BMA, she was a consulting curator for the Gracie Mansion Conservancy in New York. I think I said that wrong. And she held roles at the Museum of Modern Art in New York and Brooklyn Academy of Music and Creative Time. Her writing has been featured in several artist monographs as well as catalogs, and she's been featured in Flash Art, Art Forum, Art Papers, Hyperallergic, and Brooklyn Rail. So if everyone can please just give a very warm welcome to our guests this evening. Thanks again for showing up tonight. Y'all can come out, don't be scared, come on out. And for those of you who don't know, coming out in order, that's Torkwase Dyson, Zoë Charlton, Jamea, and Jessica.
Good evening. Good evening. Thanks so much for being here tonight. This is truly a highlight of the run of the exhibition, to be able to bring Jamea and Torkwase back to Baltimore, and always to spend more time with Zoë Charlton. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat tonight. This panel is going to be amazing. So I'd like to actually start by asking you to take a few moments for each of you to introduce yourselves in terms of, how you might share the key concerns and questions that guide who you are as an artist. So this is a little different from the bio, but just what's driving you in your query as an artist.
Testing, hello. So I'll start first. So for me, my work is really driven by my interest of unpacking who I am, what I am, where I'm from. Over the past couple of years, my work has featured self-portraiture. And so as I'm really beginning to examine my work, I'm like, this is literally art therapy. You guys are witnessing me learning and unlearning. And so, yeah, my work is really about understanding my truth and being able to stand up in my truth. And my truths are rooted in my imagination. It's rooted in ancestry. It's rooted in the landscape of this country. So yeah, that's mine.
Well, so I make a lot of different kinds of work, but I'm primarily a drawer, and I always say that I'm the most conventional figurative drawer there ever can be. Somebody comes into my studio and stands there, and I draw them. But I also make these animations and installations, and I work collaboratively. And so my concerns really are the relationships between an object and a landscape and a body. And I'm invested in the narrative potential of a body, and particularly my body or Black women's bodies, and what that has to say about access, oppression, history, the very challenging kinds of relationships that we have with each other and the spaces that we inhabit.
Thank you, Jessica, for the question. I'm learning that I'm interested in making objects that are built to welcome experiences for Black and brown people in particular. So as I learn from these more recent works, what I understand my intention is to make these compositions at the edge of my imagination, or at the edge of my engineering capacity, or at the edge of my compositional capacity, that operates to welcome and challenge the body, and to think about new ways the body moves through spaces and how the body might move through space in the future. So I think that's what my work is about in this moment. My concerns, movement.
Thank you so much for answering this question so thoughtfully, and I think giving us, as a collective, an opportunity to be grounded in your work. And I asked you that question because I also wanted you to think about who you are as an artist is enveloped in the work that you produced for this exhibition, A Movement in Every Direction, Legacies of the Great Migration. And, you know, I think the audience has, sees the finished product, but we have built, an extended dialogue and community over the course of, the past 2 years in the making of this project. But I thought it would be kind of interesting and fun and insightful to think about that earliest moment when you received a call from me and Ryan, and we were like, will you be in our show, please? And I wanted you to think about how you imagined, or what you imagined for yourself and to create for yourself for this project. So I'll leave it there, and I'm so curious to see how you'll enter into this question.
Well, for me, it was very serendipitous because by the time I had received the call, I've been researching my family's genealogy for the past 5 years, obsessively. So anyone who knows me personally, they know I'm just like, look what I discovered. And what's been so really fascinating about this genealogical journey is there's been so many unexpected discoveries that really shifted how I understand myself, how I understand this country. So I was at that point really interrogating just a lot of my understandings and a lot of my education and history in general. So by the time I received the call, I'm just like, wait a minute, okay, universe. It really presented a challenge for me to root myself in my understanding. So yeah, it was perfect. And the challenge for me was like, okay, I have all of this data, all this information. I have binders, just forensic research. And it was, how do I encapsulate everything? How do I tell such rich, unexpected, so many unexpected like details and nuances that, a lot of people don't know about their families, and here I am with this this gold mine. So it was a perfect timing for me.
I want to return to this in a few moments and dive a little deeper into how you were working through that discovery of you and also this unpacking of your family history. So we're going to come back to that. But Zoe, how did you feel when Ryan and I begged you to be in our show? And how does who you are or who you were then fold into?
Well, first I was
made?
excited. I'm just very honored to have been invited by y'all. But quite frankly, I was a little bit confused because I thought, I wonder what are y'all looking for? And it was probably about a good month in or 2 months in when I called you both and I said, hold on, I make drawings. Do you have the space for a large drawing? Or did you want an animation? Or did you want a sculpture? So I wasn't really sure what to do. But the thing that I was most excited about, which I never have an opportunity to do, is to sit and think. And so just the opportunity to be supported for a year and make work and think about work allowed me to do a handful of things. Number one, engage in a certain kind of research that I typically don't have time to do, with resources where I could ask other people whose areas of expertise were about that work. and work with people in the community that could help me actually make something bigger than anything I could make by myself. And so with that in mind, we talked probably, you, me, and Ryan talked like every couple of months. And it was very helpful to help me shape the idea for this large piece. But what I started to recognize is that I had holes in my own knowledge and even holes in the way that I would go about finding that knowledge. And so I called Dr. Jeffrey Hayes, who is the executive director of Threewalls, because I knew that her area of research is Black military life. And so we worked together twice a month in gathering that research. I also knew that I needed help figuring out how to make a construction. And from our conversations about this pop-up, I was out of my league. I originally wanted a big paper pop-up house like that, which there was a kind of impossibility. And I remembered you said, that's a great idea, but, and so it gave me the time and the resources to call Lou Zhang. And if you guys don't know Lou Zhang, you should know who she is. She is honestly the shit in Baltimore. And it was the opportunity to work with Lou to figure out how to make this construction come to life. And I was able to also call on people who I knew could help me realize something. And that was and that was Malcolm Major of Major Studios. And I really was very honored to be able to work with him. And he turned things around so quickly for me. But it just gave me the space to talk about these ideas with people that I've been wanting to talk with for a long time, about the spaces, about the parts of this work that I found truly confusing. And so this work gave me the space to be confused, to not know, to be challenged, and to really struggle in some of the best kind of ways. And also this work would not have been done without like a whole team of people putting this together. And so this work is ambitious because my community gave me the space to be ambitious and supported me in doing that.
Thank you, Zoe. There's something about the ways in which being an artist allows you to be in constant community with folks, and sometimes it's your family, sometimes it's other collaborators, friends, you know, scholars, etc. So I definitely want to return to that further into the conversation. And Torkwase, I also want to take the opportunity to refine my question for you too before you answer, because I think so much of what Zoe is describing is what I've observed in the three of you, just the sort of sweeps, sort of massive sort of jumps in scale and ambition, and I'm wondering for you, like how, if you might want to share with us, you know, when you look at your work now, the work that you made for the show Way Over There Inside Me, the journey from the first conversation to then.
So I love telling the story because it is about curators who support, provide infrastructure, and give you space to think, but also challenge you and have, I think, righteous expectations. So when you and Ryan, of course, approached me about the show, I was so happy to be in dialogue. I thought the show was discursive, fantastic. I came to you all with my first proposal, and it's that thing where we're on Zoom, right? And I screen share, and I share my first idea. And I can just see Jessica's face go. It was like her and Ryan was so confused. And I was immediately, oh my God, what's going on? What did I do? Is it too something, right? Because when you're working with people where you have long-term respect, you trust that something is not right. And so in that conversation, I was making something modular, something that could contract, right? Something that could spread out and sort of tuck in itself. And it was much smaller, much more compact. It was a sculpture of immediacy and not expanse. And they were able to communicate to me that they wanted me to go far, right? They and was curious about what I would do in this relationship with space and distance, and sort of gave me that permission. And then I went back and worked really hard on something that, again, that would allow me to take my own brain and thinking about space and form to a sort of endpoint. Like, how do you exercise your expression and exhaust the possibilities of expression within the context of the language that you work with? And this is what that show allowed me to do. It allowed me to take, and that's the first time I had done it, to take it to a point where I know I could not have gone further. This was the end of my capabilities. And that's what it means to work in this space with you and Ryan, that you push me to push my capacities to the further.
I so appreciate you sharing this in this way. And I feel like the relationship between curators and artists, it's such a dance. And I think it's also hard to know when I should rephrase this. I think sometimes there's not trust in the space to be able to not have a poker face, right? And that respect, deep respect, I think allows for a portal into saying, we don't want you to constrict, we want you to expand. We were having a conversation before tonight's event about, the ways in which I think sometimes as women apologize or make ourselves smaller. And Ryan and I, we were very adamant about saying, no, what would you do with no limitations? How would you hold that space or fill that space? So, yeah. Torkwase was like, what? And Ryan and I were like, oh yeah, we want you to do it big. And I think the three of you really, succeeded in, in stepping up into that much larger expanse, so beautifully. So, the premise of our show is deeply rooted in personal storytelling, right? And I think part of that, the ways in which we were interested in entering into these different conversations about the Great Migration was that, at the end of the day, we wanted it to be driven by you, your voices, your experiences, your stories, and for you to set those parameters. And I'm just curious if you might want to share with us, why do you think the Great Migration is a subject that has captivated us so much as a society? And I think I'm speaking from a Black lens here, because it's not a history that I think is widely taught in schools and universities, but it's one that we know so deeply and intimately. Who wants to take that one on?
I was really happy to read that question and wanted to really specifically evoke Hortense Spiller's work in The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual, and this idea that movement and imagination between this idea of body, space, geography, freedom, post-colonization, in the belly of colonization, and then the sort of racial atmosphere, in the continuation of the sort of Middle Passage, it's like these things are all about movement in every direction, right? Whether it was the expansion of the colonies, the condition of the Middle Passage, the creation of traditions of freedom, all of these are in relationship to both science and culture. Movement as a science, movement as a culture. And I don't think in any way that we'll ever stop moving in liberation strategies, both in real time and with our imaginations, because of the conditions in which we're made, because of our identities, and because of the way we've built consciousness around movement in relationship to freedom. So I don't think it's something that can be exhausted, and I think what then puts it in the catalyst of today is, of course, climate change and climate migration and how that's happening all over the world. So I think it's palpable. I think it's ongoing, and I think it's always the right time to think about different registers of migration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I appreciate everything that you said, Torkwase. These kinds of conversations, one of the reasons why we never get tired of them, I don't get tired of them, is that the Great Migration exemplifies a thread and extremes at both threads. And one is about fugitivity, and the other end is about opportunity. And within my own family, fugitivity and opportunity were the reasons why people either left or stayed where they were. And just before the panel, I was having a long conversation with one of my first cousins who is in their 70s. And I asked him, why did his family move to Miami as opposed to going north? And I had another aunt that went to Pennsylvania, where my uncle worked in the coal mines. And so in both cases, those aunts moved for opportunity. And then I had a number of cousins that left the South because of fugitivity, right? They needed to escape from where they were for a lot of different kinds of reasons that range from escaping family life or state life, or even just being a fugitive from self, right? And then that led to an opportunity for reinvention of self. And in my own family, my more immediate family, the Great Migration holds such resonance because my uncles and my dad chose to leave beyond the states for opportunity. They were in the military and felt that military life was the only way that they could gain access to all the other things, this American life, right? And so I really do as well appreciate that question because it's hard to talk about both of those because in each instance, it makes me and makes one reflect on who is being left behind or what they're being left behind.
I love that response. I'm just thinking about how reframing the Great Migration as this prolonged exercise in asserting agency, even in the most dire circumstances, was something that, I think, trying to tackle together, like how do you, what can we say about the Great Migration anew? How can we build on what we already know or what we think we know about the most transformative argument, arguably the most transformative phenomena in the 20th century, in the long 20th century. Jamea, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, for me, the Great Migration was really shrouded in mystery. And to be honest, my understanding of it was really from school. And what this process has really encouraged me was to like do something that is really important, and it's to talk to our family, to talk to our elders, to ask questions, to get an understanding. For me, what's really important, so I have a background in education as well, secondary education, did it for 13 years, and oftentimes, like I graduated from high school in 2000, and what's important for me is what is the millennials' perspective of the Great Migration, right? It was really important for me to begin to like really contextualize what that not only mean for my family, but for, Black people as a whole. So as I'm working through this question, these questions with my family, again, it's so much nuance. It's so much nuance in these conversations, and a lot of times when our history is historicized, is like, it's painted as if we're like this monolith, and that's absolutely not the case. So for me, this was, I wanted to make sure that in my depiction of it, that it's colorful, it's very contemporary. I mean, obviously I'm a contemporary artist, but it's important for me for young people to see it and to begin like, you know what, I wonder what's my family's, how my family's story revolves around this moment in history. So yeah, it sparked a new interest. For me, I was really not dismissive of it, but a lot of times when we are learning about history as a Black Indigenous American, we don't really know the details. Like, you hear of like, the Civil War, the Great Migration, and it's a lot of details and things that happen in between there that I'm just like, yeah, we need to know that to help contextualize and understand. And one of the things that was really that had me curious is like, how did 2 million, like half of the Southern population leave? Like, how did that happen? It wasn't Twitter. Like, all right, y'all, jobs popping over here. So I'm really interested in like the engineering of it, right? And from having these conversations, I started having conversations with friends, and they were saying like, yeah, people were hearing about jobs and opportunities, and I'm like, oh, okay. So this is a very cyclical thing, because there's, I was actively migrating as I was making this work. So to demystify it some, it's just like, oh, this is a story about people needing better opportunities, right?
You were talking, when we first, one of the earliest conversations that we had was about, the perception of opportunity in the North, and the ways in which the Great Migration set your family, kind of bifurcated its destinies.
Yes.
In unexpected ways, I think.
Absolutely. I think how I observe the narrative is like, okay, you have the big bad South, then we went up north and we just freedom time, yay, right? And it's like, actually, what happened when we migrated? You had the interstate projects that disrupted our communities. You had the crack epidemic. You had the heroin epidemic. You had all this blight. And so it's like, well, what do we run away from and where do we go to? And it's also this conversation about land ownership. And if you like just want to Google, it's millions of acres of Black land ownership is just, it disappeared. Yeah. So these open, when you begin to really unpack it, it's open up more questions. And like, then, as Ms. Carrie Mae Weems said, now this opened up the floor for reparations. Like what, you know, because this is very recent history and what that looks like. So, so yeah, I'm the person who's just like, okay, yeah, we came, my family, we moved to Detroit, and it's like, oh, we lost hundreds of acres of land. Was that the best thing, you know? What was that all about?
So Jamea's painting, which is a detail of which is behind us, this water runs deep. I'll run back to it here. Takes the sort of tragedy of the 1927 Mississippi River flood, from which Jamea's family was displaced in the Delta, and had to basically seek shelter west, further west of the Mississippi. And so I think this unexpected narrative, or underrepresented narrative around ecological disaster, natural disaster and displacement, and the ways in which that also becomes an opportunity for furthered oppression. You know, you are highlighting that, then, but also thinking about the vitality and, you know, of the resilience that was needed to get through it. Zoe, I'm interested in talking about the vantage point that you shared in your work in thinking about the military as a space for movement and migration, and wondered, you know, I think your proposition was so mind-boggling and also so deeply familiar, right? Like Black military participation, social uplift, and then the kind of being caught in the crossfires of imperial ambition, coming home, having more resources than you had before, but less opportunity. I wonder if you could unpack with us more about, I think, the unique perspective that you're also bringing to this conversation around movement.
So initially, I mean, it's funny to think about the original idea for this work. And it was originally only going to be the drawing, and then it was going to be the drawing, and then a large house, and then this pop-up, and then it got scaled back again. And the prompt for me was, what are signs of American imperialism on other soil, right? And I really started thinking about the land, right? The landscape, not the land, but the landscape, and the evidence of military in those lands. And I was really thinking about the kind of scar that's left by decommissioned bases. The base that my dad retired from in northern Maine is now a nature preserve. And a few years ago, my spouse and I went up there, and you can still see all the military housing. You can see all the trucks still there, which is surprising. It's been, over 20 years. And when I look at satellite photos of other decommissioned bases in other countries like Vietnam, et cetera, you can still see this scar in the land. And so originally that 18-foot drawing really was about the valley and imagining if a base were in that valley. And it started to turn into something else. It started to turn into, well, what are some other ways that, what are some other signs of military in a landscape? And I started thinking about places like Levittown, right? And who
Can you share more about Levittown?
Well, you know, Levittown, there's two. There's one in Pennsylvania, one in New York, and it was really a place that was made for people coming back from the military to live, right, to start their life anew. And it was for white people, and black folks weren't supposed to be ever living in Levittown. I am a military dependent. All I know are military bases and suburbia, right? Military bases remind me of suburbia. And so my idea of where I should live, even now, has everything to do with that history, which is intimately tied to spaces like Levittown, places like Levittown, which I find really interesting just as a thought process, right? You know, if we start thinking about the ways that our tastes, right, our thinking, our education, et cetera, are part of a colonized system, right? I have to reflect on those kinds of things. And so in this piece, there are bits of Levittown that have popped up in this Vietnamese countryside, right, amongst rice fields. And there is a woman on the far left of the drawing who is throwing a plane. It's a kind of fighter plane that was flown towards I think at the very end of World War II and primarily through Vietnam, the Vietnam conflict or war. And she's tossing it into the valley where Levittown is. And there are moments where I feel like we have to, in order to dismantle all of this, we have to like take it all down. But at the same time, I'm thinking that, I think, well, that's a part of my history. That's a part of how I understand myself and how I like to live and et cetera. So am I really gonna burn it all down, you know? And so it's a very complicated and nuanced conversation that I'm having with myself. At the same time, there's this backdrop. It actually is a backdrop that is surrounded by the Spanish moss, and it becomes a vignette. It becomes some place to move into. And you're moving into it, or I'm moving into it, from the things that are in the front, which is this pop-up of this house. And the pop-up of the house is actually my grandmother's house. And that's surrounded by this landscape, this wooded area. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm working with is something that's real in space that is stitched together or collaged together from a lot of different parts. And some parts of it are things that are already found, right? Sometimes that's the way that we organize our life, from the things that already exist to things that are hand-created, like that house is hand-drawn and hand-painted, but there are things that are ours that we create, right, that become a part of that bigger collage that is in front of a backdrop that seems to be aspirational, but it might not be aspirational. And so this whole piece called Permanent Change of Station is really about a kind of impermanence, right? And it's about the scar of expectations, the scar of American imperialism, the scar of hope, and a scar of opportunity. And so this piece is really resonant for me because I think it encapsulates a lot of the ways that I've been thinking or internalizing notions of self and origin. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I really appreciated that question because even in the way that I was writing out my responses, I was like, well, I should just go back to school because I could write for days on this. Yeah. But yeah, it's still a wonderful exercise for me to sort of go through to really find those holes and the nuances and how I want to work with them, right?
I'm thinking a lot about home not as a place, but as a condition. And I think that kind of permanence of that kind of cyclical nature of military life is also a metaphor for, or maybe I find I find connection in how Torkwase was describing this kind of permanent condition of movement for Black folks, and sort of moving in and out of, or imagining an alternative possibility to displacement. I wonder if you have anything to share, Torkwase, in response to that, or to Jamea or Zoe in their answers to this question. Like, because I saw you over there like, oof, you know?
Yes.
So let's bring it back to a thread that you wanted to jump into.
Yeah, I think that both comments have to do with questions of distance, right? Distance and moving, and Ronaldo's work on the long emancipation. Like, what does it mean to understand a continued liberation strategy that morphs, both in the micro scale, the meso scale, and the macro scale? And then the systems that either you self-produce to catapult the quotidian into freedom, or conditions that you self-produce to catapult the phenomenological into freedom. But both in this idea of, again, the colonies, expansions, dispossession, modernism, and its catastrophe set all of this sort of, not only racial capitalism into play, right? And as soon as these bodies, our ancestral bodies, are materialized, right, then genocide becomes the way of the day of movement, right? So what does it mean to continue to refuse the catastrophe of a kind of system that continuously tells us that we have no consciousness? And this is Saidiya's work, and this idea of pointing out that all of these histories of slavery, Middle Passage, colonization, all of this is creating in its systems an oppositional consciousness, right? That it doesn't make sense, right, for us to be on the coffle laughing, be on the auction block laughing and smiling. That's a condition of oppositional consciousness. So when so-called emancipation happens, and then so-called conditions of abolition happens, and then people become abolitionists, and we understand, as an abolitionist, you understand that the emancipation is ongoing. Mm-hmm. So with both categories of both the sort of local, hyper-local capitalism and the catastrophe of capital and environmental catastrophes, it must be an ongoing tradition of liberatory practices, right? And God knows that the military and its abuse of natural resources, right? And ideas of land grabbing and redlining and moving both north, east, west, and south, right, on land that's still in conditions of the dispossessed. I just want to say this ecosystem of thought, right, is why this show, I think, is so palpable, because all of it's true and all of it's ongoing, right?
I know, I just want to sit with that for a second. I know we have to move into Q&A in just a few short minutes, but I think that you've struck a chord in how we honor the complexity of this history that contains many histories within it, right? That we're still reckoning with and working through. And I wonder if maybe we can, I don't want to say end, but maybe suspend us in this moment to kind of talk through, how can we, I feel like your works, the three of you sit in this liminal or between kind of space. And that, to me, is the most fertile space because it's a space of irresolution, which is the Great Migration, I wonder how this question of liminality met with the kind of hard facts of dispossession and the hard facts of of this ability to conjure anew and to imagine anew and to move through, right? Like all of those, I think, sensibilities and modalities are deeply, deeply embedded in your works. And I wonder if you might want to share some closing thoughts about how engagement in those modes shows up in your work as an artist.
For me, the space that I'm interested in occupying when we're speaking in terms of like liminal spaces is even from a conceptual standpoint, and I'm interested in that space right outside of reality that rests in like the fantasy and mythos. And I've been there, which is why if, you know, in this piece for the show, I included a dragon. Over the past year, I've been really riding that wave. And what it has allowed me to do is to really latch on to like the metaphor of the dragon. Because if we're talking about, you know, we understand that this is impermanence, we understand that this is the reality we live in, right? It's nothing, you know, it is what it is. But how do you overcome that? And for me, what that looks like is evoking the spirit of a dragon. You know, the dragon is this, you know, this mythological, this unknown beast or being, and is it real or is it not? And for me, it's like, it's really allegorical to my experience as a Black person, you know, of not not fully knowing what I am. And it's like, oh yeah, this is my reality, this is my existence, like why me? But taking on the spirit of the dragon, right, of the unicorn has really allowed me to find peace and adventure within this American experience. And so, and even with me even attaching to the dragon or the serpent, I've been able to find the dragon and the serpent within the landscape of America. The Mississippi River is a serpent, it's a dragon. We have Serpent Mound in Ohio. So it's something really special about mythology and even looking at ancient peoples, how they identified and understood their the word and their being with, you know, metaphor. So yeah, I like that space. I've only been in this space the past year, but I can say that I've learned more about myself with just researching dragons. And just to give you like a real quick, one of the things I discovered about dragons and reading these books is that dragons communicate by rhyming. They communicate by rhyming. So even, how do Black folks, we rhyme, we spit, and, you know. So even me to even like attach on to that mythos of the dragon, this, you know, the dragon is one of the most powerful things in the universe, and it's like we're going to be okay. So that's my space. That's our space, and I'm saying that's our space because we tend to. I think there's a concerted effort to minimize our footprints, and the reality is you're everywhere. You're everywhere on this land and even above the land, inside of the land, inside of the, you know? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay. Yes. So I exist in a lot of in-between spaces. And so it's really, that's a challenging thing for me to answer, only because of that. But I think it's in those spaces that I find the most freeing. And I find, and it's interesting because Torkwase, when you were talking about liberation, I was like, well, that's the liminal space. That is actually the place where I find the most opportunity, the most space for reinvention, right? Or even just invention or becoming of myself. And it just makes me think about the things that I do that lead to liberation are always the things that are about being in the process, going towards something, being in between something. And so I found that really powerful and resonant, and it actually makes me really excited to name that liminal space a liberatory space, which is very different from freedom, right? And because it's something that doesn't stop, right? And so, yeah, so I appreciate those comments and a way to expand and affirm being in the in-between, and for whatever reasons, feeling comfortable in that in-betweenness. I love that thoughtfulness.
Sorry about that. Yes. Yes, in between, the liminal. Yeah. What was I going to say? I read that question. Oh, I wanted to talk about Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, from the islands to the Bronx to as a freedom fighter, right? And let's just talk about the liminal space of the freedom fighters, right? And the people that we are of. And that migration movement is of the methodology of freedom fighters, right? And so as I think about this work and movement and liberation strategies and engineering and communication and the haptic in relationship to the modern and the industrial, what I think about and how this piece has led me to Kwame Ture is to think about Black power as a Black democracy, like real democracy. And the reason he found himself in Lowndes County working with SNCC is to fight for Black power, right? And the reason before even the Black Panther Party expanded into what we know it to be now, that the sign itself, the image itself, just to tap into what it means to think about imagery and representation and ideas and imaginations of freedom, that is the Black tradition, right? So we think about the Black Panther as an emblem of freedom and Black democracy as a condition of then the vote, and the power of movement and force and velocity. All of that is wrapped up into what it means to still be under the condition of emancipation, right? So when I think about how I got to this piece, I had done a couple pieces in relationship to ideas of distance. Distance is power, distance, you know, oftentimes running from white folks trying to put distance between you and the violence of whiteness. So I titled one piece, I Belong to the Distance, because I believe that condition of movement and liminality is absolutely a face of liberation. And it also is a space where we can register different kinds of movement, whether the movement is a kind of stillness as you move through a space, or a movement is a run or a train, that understanding liberation and movement at different registers, I think also is a kind of, it's the genius of the dispossessed, to know when that movement has to happen at a stealth level or that movement has to happen, at a level of a train or a level of mass in silence. So I'm interested in that, the capability, of articulating the power of movement as a condition of a postmodern reality, right? Or a decolonized reality is the freedom of movement and the decriminalization of movement and being able to go where you want and breathe in clean air and drink clean water, right? And and have a real historical relationship with indigeneity and its relationship to movement, right? And nomadicity. So that's what that piece for me is, an arc of learning the relationship between modernism, what does it mean, seriality, what does it mean to have agency within these built vernaculars of oppression and to move through them and triumph, right, and last, and belong to a certain distance of Black life form. Does that make sense?
And when that movement has to be collective movement versus our own individual, right? Yeah.
I love that, move in triumph. Couldn't have said that more beautifully or powerfully. So I think we have time for a couple of questions. So Sabina, wave Sabina if you can, so folks can see you. If you have a question, she'll find you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hope. Should I stand? Thank you for coming and sharing your work with us. So I wrote this down so I didn't forget. All of your work demands attention and takes up space to share a story that is deeply personal to you and your history. My question is, and forgive me if this is like too personal, how do each of you take up space and feel present in your personal lives, and how does that influence your practice?
I love space. I love it. I love it. I'll say one of the things that I'm practicing now is space and consciousness, right? In this sort of in the ecosystem of all of my community in the battle of this long emancipation condition, really the way I take up space is to deal with my mind personally. This is your question, personally, right? Personally. Is to deal with mind, thought, and consciousness, non-attachment, acute awareness, and know that my gray matter, my brain, is a machine in itself, and that I have to condition it, right, to be ready and alert to acute liberation, right? So capitalism and all these kind of conditions scrambles consciousness. So my space and practice right now is to gain space in my thoughts and being so that I can be aware of acute moments of liberation. Does that make sense? Personally, that doesn't necessarily make its way into my art all the time, but as a personal human being,
Yeah. I love that response. I just loved it. Yeah, right. Personally, I loved it too. That's a really beautiful question. And, often in these talks, we don't have that space for this kind of intimacy. So thank you so much for doing that. I'm 60 inches tall, and I tend to think that I don't take up any space. Thank you. That's right, 5-footers in the house, yes. And I tend to think that I don't take up a lot of space, but according to my colleagues and my friends, that I do. And one of the ways that I intentionally take up space in my personal life is the way that I connect the different things that I do together. And so my studio is one thing, but I have a politic and a value system that I need to be in the forefront of all the decisions that I make. And so I take up space by being involved on committees and on boards because I want my thinking to take up space, I want my politic to take up space, and I need my relationships, especially the ones that overlap, to be bigger and louder than what I can do by myself. And that directly relates to the work that I do and this work here, but it's not about the content of the work, but it's in the making of it. And so, because I recognize that collective work is core to how I understand myself and how I can move things that are important to me forward, the only ways that I can amplify that is by overlapping with someone else. And so for that reason, I understand that I'm probably about 6 feet tall, right, because of it. And that is with intention.
Whew, that's a really good question. So for me, even as a young child, up into the present, I'm quiet. And the reason why I live in my head, I've always historically lived in my head, and I've always had that feeling like, Jamea, you're so crazy, like people are never going to understand you. Like I live in the abstract, I live in the fantasy. So art has always been that vehicle for me. It has always been that vehicle for me. And so as I'm becoming more comfortable in my personhood, the art is becoming like larger, it's becoming louder, right? And I allow my ideas to live in that vein. Also, as a mother, like I have 3 amazing sons, a beautiful husband. And part of my taking up space is empowering them and allowing them to see me actualize my ideas, actualize my dreams. They are an extension of me, my progeny. So them moving in the world and their knowing and then being comfortable and knowing thyself is enabling me to enable them to take up space. It's allowing my ancestors, we are our ancestors, right? So although as a 40-year-old woman, I don't have to talk as loud. I don't have to make a scene, but me being able to feel beautiful in my body and my hair and my ideas, like I'm comfortable with not being so loud, yeah, I'm making sense, it's cool. Because I can go way off, so I'm like, Jamea, stay focused. So I think as women, as Black women, just even how we are allowed to, how we dress, because we're conditioned to bridle ourselves, to not be so loud, to not be so, and I discovered that, me being quiet is also a fear. And I've just given myself permission, like, okay, we live also in a world that's like, you have to be politically correct. You can't do as much, but that's why the art becomes so important. And I feel like, I realize like artists are really superheroes because we have the language and tools to say things that a lot of people can't say. So I'm just like, I'm taking up the most space in the work, and this is my mentee as well, and part of me taking up space is empowering you and your sister to be able to like express yourself, right? And even like as I say that, like that should be something that we all are able to do, to take up space. And how as we have these conversations, it's just like, well, yeah, we should be able to articulate and express ourselves, And so it's just really emphasized how special and important this space is. Me being an artist is. So, yeah.
Hello. First off, just thank you all for an amazing talk. I wrote down so many questions, but I got to stick to one, obviously. Just looking at you all's work, and I can't wait to be in the space and absorb what all that feels like. I'm thinking about the ways in which your works articulate a kind of evolution of the Black imaginary, and ways in which they take up space. You all mentioned phenomenologically, existentially, of course. I see it all, I feel it all. I'm wondering if you all could tell me, in your own way, ways in which the Black imaginary and the ways in which it articulates a kind of magical process that is very real. At one point, the Black imaginary was just conceptions of freedom, where that was just an imaginary idea for us, and the way in which the Black imagination, when it's articulated in a certain kind of way, shakes the world and changes the world, and the ways in which across the Atlantic, Black, brown, European folks are looking at us and waiting for us to articulate our Black imaginary in a kind of way. What does the Black imaginary mean for each of you in these ways of decolonization, these ways of articulating liberation?
You know, one of the things that really helped pull it out of me is really this exhibition and doing a genealogy, because one of the things that I discovered is that Jamea Richmond-Edwards and land and America, it's inseparable. I think oftentimes we remove ourselves from this land and the history of this land. So really quick, I discovered in Georgia, where my family is from, Macon, there are step pyramids there. It's pyramids all over this country, ancient mounds. And just relocating back to Detroit, I'm looking at the architecture there, which is similar here in Baltimore. And I realized as I began researching more and understanding myself and my family in relationship to America, the world, I'm noticing things now. And one of the things I noticed was, like, there's dragons and unicorns and all of this architecture everywhere, right? So as I'm beginning to look at the architecture, I'm also looking at the sculptures, the figures within the sculpture, and a lot of them look like me. So what that means is you have what I'm calling this old world architecture. You have these amazing mounds and pyramids that we can't have that conversation without me and my ancestry, which is a little clouded, but I know that it's there. So the Black imagination is infinite. It has always existed. We wouldn't be here today if it wasn't. So I think part of my job and what I want to encourage is to remove that construct of, like, it's bigger than Black imagination. Like, it's like Black matter imagination. It's the ethers. It's the, and I think oftentimes we separate ourselves from the ether. If you study what melanin is, it's literally like stardust, literally. No cap, it's stardust. So what that means for me is like there isn't any capacity to what, I just have to have the gumption and courage to imagine, right? So, so part of the meditation for me is to be courageous, and be courageous and put your ideas out there. And the beauty of being an artist, no one can't say nothing to me. You can't say nothing to me, That's where it lives, and I think that it's part of our responsibility as artists to expand the consciousness of the world. we are only as progressive and as imaginative as we could perceive, you know what I mean? So it's just like, it's there.
Thank you for that question. I would need more time to develop a thoughtful response about where I think the Black imaginary is right now, but I can tell you about my grandmother's infinite imagination and how she and her generation thought about it. And that's me. My grandmother had a third-grade education. She sharecropped. She sold squirrel stew. She made all of her children's clothes, the tablecloths and the curtains and their dresses all matched. She sold property when she needed money. She raised hogs, grew sugarcane, all of those things. And every time she got paid, she squirreled away a little bit of money. And she started buying property in the panhandle of Florida in the 40s. That was rare. She walked from Havana, Florida to Tallahassee, Florida. And so when I think about the Black imaginary, I think about that infiniteness. Like, she didn't actually understand what she was working towards, except she knew that she was working towards liberation for her family, collective liberation for her family. And so when I think about the Black imaginary, it actually involves, it's anchored in liberation, and it's anchored in collective work. And so I think about how I'm going to work collectively for those things that I actually can't even name yet, but knowing that that kind of work will lead to something after me.
Your question is great, and this is hard to follow. So I want to be useful to you. So I think I'm going to say this. This is how I dive into when I experience someone else's imagination. Is that something a little bit? Okay. So like the first time I saw Minnie Evans' drawings, or Space is a Place, or another one that had me like taking leaps and bounds with the artist, right? So someone like a Toni Morrison and Pilot, and these writings where individuals who are creatives create these. What is in this work? Let me be specific. What is in this work is ideas of cartography, geography, water, language, sound, relationships, intimacy. So I think when I experience the Black imagination through artists, most of the time the structure of the work is what I'll say discursive, right? So there's this movement and migration in these structures of storytellings or paintings or sound, where I get to move between the universe, imagination, clothes, a song, someone else's memory. So when I am inside the imagination of someone who is Black, and I am swimming in their imagination, and the form that they're presenting this imagination in is structured. So my movement is smooth and graceful and tough and energetic. That's why I like to live, right? Where I am diving in Black form, Black life form, where these structures of creativity and the technique of these structures allow me space of liberation while I'm witnessing or while I'm being in. Does that make sense? It's different.
Well, with that, I feel like we have to leave it there. We've got to leave it there because we're over time. But I also think what a beautiful place to leave it, because what you've done is mirrored the experience of your work in this exhibition, which we have the privilege to have with us for a few more weeks until January 29th. So I want to thank you, Jamea, Zoe, and Torkwase, and invite the audience to thank you as well for sharing your worlds with us.
Yes.
What a privilege to just live in your orbit, seriously. I know. Shout out to Ryan, and thank you so much to Tracy Beal, Sabina Diaz, and Cynthia Hodgthorne, and the whole BMA team for their continued support. So thank you. Have a good night, everyone.